Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, September 28th, 2024. We begin with our dear sister Luyanda Kaboka, bringing us a taste of the African drumbeat historical calendar, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston and Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne will be joined on the line by Andrew Krinks, author of the book White Property, Black Trespass, Racial Capitalism, and the Religious Function of Mass Criminalization. Lastly, in the second half of our program, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Nik Ribianszky, senior lecturer at Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland. For our purposes today, she's the author of the book Generations of Freedom, Gender, Movement, and Violence in Natchez, 1779 to 1865. We have a lot of valuable historical gems for you as usual, so keep your ears right here. Now, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Erykah Badu, Joey Alexander, Stanley Turrentine, Thelonious Monk, Nat Adderley, and Donald Byrd. Now people get ready for this train of coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Andrew Krinks.
Happy is man that found that wisdom, and with that getting get overstanding, and knowledge shall be added unto thee. And your way up be good to those people you met, 'cause you would have meet the same people.
Molweni ekhaya, This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with Freedom Now's African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. This presentation will highlight significant progressive revolutionary activists and events in the struggle for humanity and spirituality over greed and the ruling class. September 28, 1958, Guinea, West Africa votes no, not only to French colonialism, but votes no to any economic and political ties to France, thereby proclaiming a complete independence from European rule. This mass decision set in motion the development of the most revolutionary African microstate in Africa, laying the groundwork for the development of Pan-Africanism as an objective and ideology of Nkrumahism to racism. September 29, 1965, CIA and its puppets overthrow the progressive democratic government in Indonesia of Sukarno and murder over 500,000 people. Indonesia composes of over 18,110 islands and is the world's largest Muslim country, targeted due to its multitude of natural resources. September 30th, 1975, the military dictatorship called the Derg declares a state of emergency and seizes control over the Ethiopian government, imprisoning His Majesty Haile Selassie Jah and slaughtering students, intellectuals, and trade unionists, ending the longest rule of an emperor in Africa. October 1st, 1949. China, one of the poorest and most divided countries in the world, is liberated under the leadership of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. After 30 years of armed struggle, thereby liberating women, peasants, and working class from centuries of stagnant development. October 2nd, 1800, Nat Turner was born. The week before Gabriel Prosser, a well-known rebellious slave leader, was hanged. Nat Turner, a gifted child, believed that God spoke to him directly and commanded him to lead African people to destroy the system of slavery. Nat Turner used religion as a weapon of revolution. October 2nd, 1858, Queen Mary Thomas, was born. She was an African slave rebellion leader in St. Croix, which is part of the U.S. colony in the Virgin Islands today. On October 1st, 1878, she and two other slave women, Rebecca Frederick and Exeline Solomon, aka the Black Amazon, led a revolt and killed many whites and set fire to the plantation houses of white slave owners, which also freed many slaves. October 3rd, 1952. The Mau Mau Rebellion against the British colonial rule in Kenya, East Africa begins. The Mau Mau's major targets were African collaborators with the British, thus beginning the class struggle, which has intensified throughout Africa and the diaspora. The Mau Mau correctly understood that without collaborationists, England could not maintain colonial rule. October 3rd, 1904. The people of Namibia, formerly called Southwest Africa, began armed struggle against German colonial rule, evolving into total liberation under the leadership of Southwest African People's Organization. This has been Freedom Now at 90.7 FM in Southern California, 98.7 FM in Central California. Freedom Now's mission statement and profile is on the web at kpfk.org under programs. We hope that these reminders of bygone struggle will motivate those in the listening audience not to get frustrated with the slow pace of change. We have a rich history of struggle that has moved world society forward. We would like to have a unity chant of Amandla Awetu, which means all power to the people. So join us as we chant Amandla in response Awetu. Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne. And with me on the line is Andrew Krinks, author of the book, White Property, Black Trespass, Racial Capitalism and the Religious Function of Mass Criminalization. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Andrew Krinks.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book?
I wrote this book. It's an expression in part for me of more than a decade of study and of organizing that formed questions that I was increasingly interested in answering about, kind of at a fundamental level, why do we have police and prisons at all? Which is certainly, I'm not the first one to ask that by any stretch. But I wanted to, I had some suspicions about how the answer could use some new nuance that we haven't heard as much before, and that has to do with the role of religion in its ongoing, not just its formation, but its ongoing functioning. And in addition to that, my argument, you can kind of infer from the title a bit, is that we also can't understand where mass criminalization comes from, where cops in cages come from, without understanding their intimate and original and ongoing relation to whiteness and private property, and that you can't understand whiteness and private property in all of its fullness without understanding the role of religion in the formation of those phenomena as well. So it's a book that tries to trace the continuity and the religiosity of the color line, the property line, and the so-called thin blue line, showing how those lines kind of order our world and how they serve a kind of religious function in making place and making space in the world that we move through.
I take it that racial capitalism is a kind of overarching theme in your book. What do you mean by racial capitalism?
So with that term, I am drawing and building upon the work of Cedric Robinson and other interlocutors of his since then, including Robin Kelley and Ruthie Gilmore and others. And so with them, I understand racial capitalism to be a way of talking about capitalism. In other words, it's not a different kind of capitalism. It is capitalism that before capitalism ever crossed any body of water from Europe, that it was already taking the shape of a kind of what Robinson will call racialism, which is to say a kind of a social differentiation based on something that was understood to be a kind of a racial differentiation. Now, where I try to build on that is that to say that yes, that capitalism originates in and through social differentiation that is in a form racial differentiation, but that those racial differentiations get absolutized and deepened and widened as they cross the Atlantic. And so, race comes to mean something slightly different now than it does then in the racialism internal to Europe. And that primarily happens through, the settler colonial and transatlantic slave trades and conquering of indigenous peoples and lands. And that through that, you get a form of capitalism that is still racial capitalism, but the racial capitalism there has a more, kind of carries more weight, it's more absolute, it draws lines more absolutely, even spatial lines, property lines, etc., than it had when it was just internal to Europe. So that's a little bit about what I mean. Exploring enclosure is important to my book, and how, even within Europe, enclosure, some historians refer to it as a xenophobic phenomenon, even internal to Europe, which I think supports Robinson and others' thesis about the role of race internal to Europe and capitalism there. but then also how it expands by way of the violence of European colonialism beyond its borders.
Should our audience infer that people of African descent, being early victims of racial capitalism, settler colonialism, enslavement, are still disproportionately incarcerated as a direct result of those founding engines?
Yes, yes, I do hold that position, and there's a lot of work that's been done, obviously, around the what Saidiya Hartman will call the afterlives of slavery, taking the form of carceral institutions, policing, etc. And I also think it's important, along with this position, to say that my argument is not just that the system is racist and anti-Black because its primary actors hold like anti-Black bias. That is often, maybe overwhelmingly, the case, but it's more than just saying that the actors of the system are themselves holding anti-Black or racist bias, but that rather these institutions simply come into being in order to serve and protect an order based on whiteness and property, which is a racial capitalist settler colonial order. So it's no mistake then that it continues to serve that function, even if it's evolved in different ways, including trying to adapt this premise of safekeeping, which definitely comes later with these institutions, these so-called public safety institutions. That's very much a misnomer, because they were not created for safety. If they were created for any kind of safety, it was the safety of the hierarchical order itself, the anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, white, propertied, patriarchal order itself. So yes.
So we can posit from your argument that racial capitalism, settler colonialism are still forces that are pushing Black people in particular into incarceration. What does the role of religion play in your narrative?
Yes, and this is the part of my project that I think is somewhat of a new offering. I'm certainly not the only one to reflect on how religion has played a role in these systems, but so often amongst most historians and scholars of carceral institutions, the premise is that, or the presumption rather, is that sure, there was religious thinking at their inception, but that they have largely secularized, and so therefore it's no longer that helpful to think of them in those terms. My argument is that yes, it was there at their inception, and that has not gone away, even if it has changed form, so that it, the explicit nature of a kind of, penitence, for instance, at a penitentiary, has maybe gone into the background a little bit. I still think that the foundations are the same, and so I can say a little bit about how I come at this. So for me, the argument that I make in the book is that, in addition to the fact that the formation of whiteness and property, which happens at the same time and is the same places, depends at every stage upon Euro-Christian rationale. Euro-Christian rationale, just to say, white, a Christianity that is indistinguishable from whiteness. So that's the first thing to understand, and that those institutions give rise to carceral and police institutions that exist in turn to maintain that pseudo-sacred social order of whiteness and property. But then the part where, what in terms of what's the religious function of the police and prisons themselves, I trace some long trajectories of Christian theological thought through figures living around 300 to 500 years apart from each other. The first is Augustine of Hippo, the second Anselm of Canterbury, and the third is John Calvin, who is writing and thinking right at the precipice of the formation of modernity and capitalism and carceral institutions as we know them. And the trajectory that I trace, the continuities that I trace between those thinkers is for thinking around sin and salvation. Now, for them, and there's certainly differences among them, but what they hold in common is that sin can be understood in the Christian tradition as a refusal to be properly subject to a life-giving God, and that salvation in turn requires and entails a return to proper life-giving subjection to that God. So my argument is that what I kind of term this soteriology of subjection, soteriology is a theory of salvation, is a carceral one. This stream of Christian thought is a carceral one, and that it provides a kind of conceptual infrastructure that becomes in turn material infrastructure for systems that frame crime in a way that resonates with sin as a refusal to be in one's place in a social hierarchy, a refusal therefore to be properly subject, and the salvation, so to speak, that happens through caging as a return to subjection that not only saves the one caged, but saves the order from the moral disorder introduced allegedly by those who refuse to be properly subject. And that's why, we're talking primarily about the enemies of whiteness and property. So all unpropertied people, all non-white people, and particularly Black as well as indigenous peoples. And so that's kind of the role. There's much more in the book about how this kind of plays out, including some very recent reflections, including on, the testimony of Darren Wilson, who kills Mike Brown 10 years ago, who says that Mike Brown, it looked like a demon. And so I kind of, when he was preparing to shoot him and kill him. And so, this is a story from the beginning of these institutions to the present, and that's part of what my book tries to narrate, and to say that, if we fail to recognize this mythological, religious, existential function that these institutions fulfill for an order that looks to them for their safety, which is to say their salvation, those two words are connected etymologically. If we fail to understand them at this level, then we will fail to break their power.
So in light of the fact that Black people in the United States are a major victim of mass incarceration, and at the same time are largely Christian, how do you square that circle?
Well, one place you can begin with that is, looking back to its precursors in chattel slavery, and the fact that at the beginning, and this is kind of to paint in broad brushstrokes, but at the beginning, you had this premise among European American colonial slavers, that the people that they enslaved, the African peoples that they enslaved, could not also be Christian like them, because that would imply a kind of capacity for freedom and a kind of a destiny for freedom that a white Christian identity requires and presumes. And so there was some worry around African peoples taking on that role of becoming Christians as well. And so well, hold on one second. Sorry about that. So you have then a little while later, you have this phenomenon of slaveholders finally saying, you know what, maybe they can become Christians if we understand that by Christian, we mean one who is a slave to God or to Christ. And so you have this room for, even within chattel slavery, those who are held subject by it, to also be those who are exercising the same faith as their slaveholders, just in a very kind of distinct way. And so in a parallel way, you might say that, it's possible for this, what I think is still a religiously functioning institution, to to fulfill a kind of a religious function at the same time that it cages people who abide by the same tradition of Christianity that gives birth to that institution. So just as there were enslaved people who were themselves followers of the Christian tradition after some time, even if, syncretically with other indigenous traditions that they come from, there is also the fact that the institutions that hold them subjects are, in some way coming out of this a tradition, even if a different stream of it. So I think that I wrote this book in part because I want people to reflect on and take seriously these legacies of the role of religion in these institutions. And I could say more about this, but my conclusion is not that religion is the problem. It's just that they have a religious function, and that there are also religious dimensions to the work of building a world beyond these institutions, and that needs attention as well.
Finally, Andrew Krinks, author of the book White Property, Black Trespass, Racial Capitalism, and the Religious Function of Mass Criminalization. What do you mean by the pseudo-sacred power of whiteness?
Yeah, so that to me is a way of talking about the fact that I interpret whiteness, and I do so, with a lot of interlocutors throughout the book, including prime among them W.E.B. Du Bois. And it's a way of talking about the fact that, we should understand whiteness as the manifestation of a European aspiration to godlike power in the world, by which I mean godlike invulnerability, transcendence, a kind of infinitude, a kind of ability to rise above other people's suffering, and not recognize that one is part of other people's suffering, a kind of innocence. And one of my starting points for this is looking at Du Bois's famous quote in The Souls of White Folk that, what is religion that it would be so valued by so many? And he says, I come to understand that whiteness is ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen. And I actually think that it's a mistake when historians leave off, or any commentators leave off the forever and ever, amen from that, because, that comes from the so-called Lord's Prayer in the Christian tradition. And those words in that prayer are preceded by this confession that God is the one who holds all sovereignty over all things and all people. And so it's essentially replacing God with whiteness. And, you even have David Walker in the 19th century saying, if white people could, wouldn't they just dethrone Jehovah and put themselves upon his throne? There's this long-standing presumption or discernment within Black radical thought that whiteness kind of can be understood as the attempt to play God in the world, which James Cone also talks about. So I call whiteness a pseudo sacred reality because it comes about through the desire of Europeans to hold a kind of exclusive transcendence in relation to the rest of the world. That helps explain how it continues to move in the world, how it continues to infect the world and burden the world, including even those who are allegedly inheritors of it, who are in essence blinded and given a kind of a spiritual sickness of not being able to see the role of whiteness in so much violence and death in the world.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Andrew Krinks. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
Welcome back here to Freedom Now. We're going to keep this train moving and send you back over to Dr. Gerald Horne, who's now being joined on the line by Nik Ribianszky. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Nik Ribianszky, Senior Lecturer at Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and author of the book Generations of Freedom, Gender, Movement, and Violence in Natchez, 1779 to 1865. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Ribianszky.
Dr. Horne, the pleasure and honor is all mine. Thank you so much for inviting.
And thank you for accepting. So why did you write this book?
So I got into the topic of Natchez really following my first visit there in 1994. It was actually my first trip to Mississippi. At the time I was living in Nashville, Tennessee, and a friend of mine took me down to Natchez, and we went to a bookstore, and he bought me a book, a diary that was published by a free Black man, William Johnson, a diary that he kept from 1835 until 1851. And I was just entirely fascinated because it was my first trip to Natchez. This was really the first time that I had really, read anything as extraordinary as this diary. And then the following year, I began my graduate studies at Michigan State University. And the first class that I took was with Wilma King, a class that she taught on African American women's history. And I started delving into the topic of free women of color. And I decided to look at Johnson's diary and what it could reveal about the women, free women of color in his own family, free women of color in the community of Natchez, and also enslaved women, because, as I found through research, the line between freedom and enslavement was very fluid. And so I was interested in what he recorded about enslaved women. Some of the women in his family began their lives as enslaved. And there were other women that he wrote about who were free women who got, passed through that line and became enslaved or re-enslaved. So that's really how I came into the topic.
Now, before the U.S. took over that part of Mississippi, there were Spanish colonizers. It was worse for free people of color during that period.
I would, when you look at all of the different governances, bodies of governance in Natchez, in the lower South, it's difficult sometimes to really decide who was worse, because at the end of the day, enslavement is an oppressive system. But if in comparing the Americans who came later than the Spanish did, the Spanish controlled Natchez from 1779 until 1795. They offered more avenues to freedom than the Americans did. And due to the fact also that Natchez was still largely a frontier society at the time that the Spanish inhabited and governed Natchez, just by that nature, there was a bit more movement, a sense of possibility for free people of color and for enslaved people. So, I would have to argue that the Spanish, they were more, there were just more possibilities for people. So, for example, under the Spanish system, if an enslaved person had the purchase price for themselves, which was established by the courts, whether they had earned it through skills of their own, whether they were gifted that money or what have you, if they had the money to purchase themselves out of slavery, they would receive a certificate of freedom. Under the Americans, which was more, based on the English common law, it was really up to the enslaver, and if their disposition favored the freedom of a person that they enslaved, if they had nursed them through a sickness, if they had, fought in one of the many wars in early American history, or, if they had come up with the purchase money themselves, it was really at the discretion of the American enslaver. So I would definitely say that under the Spanish, there were more avenues to freedom.
Now, you suggest that violence was, quote, foundational, unquote, to freedom for free women of color, especially sexual violence. What did you mean by that?
So if you look at what becomes the United States, Ira Berlin wrote, in a lot of ways, his book, The Free Negro, was very foundational to my studies as a scholar of history and looking at the differences between free Black people in the North, free Black people in the Upper South, and free Black people in the Lower South, of which Natchez is settled firmly. And the population of free Black people in the Lower South was much smaller than in the Upper South. And a lot of times it was a result of relationships, of sexual relationships between especially enslaved women and white men. And so you did have that kind of foundational, that bedrock experience of enslaved women being, and I look at sexual relationships, whatever the case, there is always a spectrum. Some of these relationships, there might have been a germ of affection, that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, because enslavement was a system that really was built on violence, on force, on oppression, the issue of choice was very, very constrained for enslaved women. And so we had a number of women that did have children with white men, and at times the women themselves and their children would gain their freedom. And, just to give you an example of one such woman, Elizabeth Barland, she was enslaved by a man named Jacob Eiler, and she had a relationship with another white man, the nature of which is very unclear, but he purchased her and their 4 children during the Spanish period, and on the same day emancipated all 5 of them. And Elizabeth and Andrew Barland went on to have 8 more children together. And so we can see from this one manumission example of a woman who had a relationship with a white man. It's not unclear, again, what the nature of the relationship was, but 12 children resulted, and many of those children had children of their own, and so on. So this kind of sexual exploitation, sexual violence that women were exposed to in slavery was really foundational in so many key ways to the formation of the community.
In that light, who was Amy Johnson?
So, like Elizabeth Barland, Amy Johnson was born enslaved in Natchez during the Spanish period. And it's not clear, which is, somewhat of a frustrating experience for historians of slavery, right? There's a lot that's unclear. Sometimes people are just a name on a document, on a deed, on a marriage record, a will, that kind of thing. But regardless, Amy Johnson was born into slavery, and when she was 30 years old, she was freed by her white enslaver, a man named William Johnson. And Amy had 2 children with her enslaver, Adelia and a son, William Johnson, who I had mentioned earlier, who kept a diary. And when Amy received her freedom, her children remained enslaved for a number of years. So that kind of, we don't know what the relationship between Amy and her enslaver was. She did receive her freedom, obviously, which was not the common experience for enslaved women who had sexual relationships with their enslavers. The great majority of women and any children that might have resulted from these relationships remain enslaved. But for Amy, she did receive her freedom. It was uncertain if her children would also receive that freedom, and if something would have happened to her enslaver, say if he would have died, if he would have become indebted, she could have lost her children through sale and that kind of thing. But happily for the Johnson family, all 3 of them did eventually receive their freedom, and they went on to stay in Natchez and prosper in Natchez, they and their families, their children, grandchildren, and that kind of thing.
So as your previous remarks have suggested, female Negro property owners tended to outnumber male Negro property owners in terms of full inheriting property from Euro-American men. What are the implications of this phenomenon?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And again, I'm sorry to go back to both of the families that I mentioned, the Barlands as well as the Johnsons. It is sometimes surprising to people to find that people like Elizabeth Barland and her 4 children who were born into slavery, or people like Amy and Adelia and William, who likewise were born into slavery, oftentimes became enslavers themselves. Sometimes, they found themselves willed enslaved people from their white partners. In the case of Elizabeth Barland, that's entirely what happened. The person who freed her, William Barland, who in his will called her his friend and companion, and one of their sons, Andrew Barland, who petitioned the state legislature in Mississippi to be given the privileges of whiteness, of legal whiteness, and who said that his father called his mother his colored, I'm using air quotes, colored wife. And, they got property, including enslaved people from their white enslaver. Well, I'm sorry, he wasn't their enslaver. That would be the Johnson family, William Johnson, the enslaver who gave freedom to his 2 children with Amy Johnson. As far as I can see, they were not willed any sort of property. William Johnson, the son, learned the barbering trade, and through that he came to have 3 different barber houses in Natchez, a plantation on the outskirts of Natchez, and he and his wife, Ann Battles Johnson, and their children held enslaved people throughout all of their lifetimes. So, just because of the nature of there being more women and girls of color, free women and girls of color in Natchez, there was a population imbalance that privileged. And then we do see, since many of the people in Natchez who did get their freedom from white men, sometimes that sort of property, whether it's money, whether it's an actual land, any buildings, but also human property was gifted to them, was left to them.
So what was passing, and what role does it play in your pages?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. If I could just add something, Dr. Horne, to that topic of enslavement that I think is a really critical one. I didn't mention that many times with free people of color that they were forced to hold members of their own family in slavery. And this was the case with, if we look back at the Johnson family, at the risk of talking a little bit, much about them, Ann Battles Johnson, William Johnson's wife, actually held a family member and her children in slavery. It was one of her cousins. And there were other free people, free women in Natchez that were forced to hold family members. There was a friend of the Johnson family, Hester Cummins, who held her sister and her sister's daughter in slavery because the state of Mississippi, over time, it became very restrictive to free people. It was an expensive process. It required at different times for people to go and petition the state legislature. So sometimes, in addition to economic reasons for people and holding enslaved people, sometimes it was family members that were being held. That being said, sorry to transition to this topic of passing, which is very fascinating to me. And there were a number of free people of color in Natchez who were passing either consciously, they were, kind of slipping over the color line. Some of them were forced to, as in the case of a woman named Harriet Johnson, who, as far as I can see, she had no relation to the Amy and William Johnson family, but she was born enslaved, and she received her freedom when a man, William Cullen, ended up purchasing her and their son, Robert, out of slavery. And she was in Wilkinson County, which is a neighboring county to Adams, where Natchez is. And she moved back with William Cullen, and they went on to have 3 more children together. And he passed property down to them. And then this was in the 1820s, I believe 1826 is when she got her freedom. So she lived in Natchez for several decades as a free woman of color. But in 1860, 2 white men, one a justice of the peace, came to her house and announced that she had 10 days to leave the state of Mississippi because she was an unlicensed free woman of color residing there, and she had 10 days to leave the state. And she responded to this by producing witnesses, claiming that she had never been enslaved, that she did not have any African blood or ancestry at all. And, it was a very interesting case, but in the end, she did prevail through that. And so she stayed in Natchez. There were other people like the son that I mentioned, Andrew Barland, who petitioned the state of Mississippi that he be given privileges. And in his petition, he acknowledged that his father was a white man, that his mother was a free woman of color, and that he identified that his values were aligned with that of his father and of the planter community in Natchez, that he was an enslaver, that he was married to a white woman himself, and that he had those sorts of values, that he had served on different committees, that he had voted, and that kind of thing. So we do see this passing happening as a matter of emergency in some sense, with women like Harriet Johnson, but also with people like Andrew Barland, as an attempt to really kind of carve out a space and protect a privileged space for themselves, because of that issue of whiteness being equated with freedom and blackness being equated with slavery. So really the entire population of free Black people is so fascinating because it was very ambiguous. And although the laws existed, at various times that really did not privilege free Black people, depending on the time period, depending on the individual circumstances of free Black people and the allies that they had within the places that they lived, their treatment was very, very ambiguous, and it did not always coincide with the laws.
So to what extent was there resistance by the enslaved, by the free people of color, particularly when the U.S. Civil War erupts, 1861 to 1865?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another great question. Resistance is really one of those topics that has fascinated me and, so many other scholars throughout time. And Natchez did have a Black majority from the very earliest times when the Americans acquired the territory. And the white population was probably about, just to give you some numbers, in 1860, there were over 14,000 enslaved people in Adams County. And I believe the number of white people during that time was at around 6,000 or so. And the number of free Black people was only 225. So we can see that, the enslaved far outnumbered all of them. So it took this system of oppression, of violence to keep enslaved people, within that system. And people resisted from all things as far as overt acts of violence, planning rebellions against the power structure, against their individual enslavers, to smaller acts of resistance, to, running away, to slowing down the pace of work. So, resistance happened in so many forms. And going back to that issue of passing, I do argue that for the people who were able to pass, people who had enough European or Native American ancestry to, kind of call into question their African ancestry, they did have that ability to resist this system that really, obviously for free people of color, it gave them advantages that enslaved people didn't have. The ability to, use the court system, to accumulate property legally, to marry legally, and that kind of thing. But as we saw with Harriet Johnson, there was still that level of uncertainty and risk. And so I do argue that she used that tool of passing as a form of resistance. But again, it wasn't available to all people, certainly.
Finally, Nik Ribianszky, senior lecturer at Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland, author of the book Generations of Freedom, Gender, Movement, and Violence in Natchez, 1779 to 1865. What's next on your research agenda?
Oh, thank you. It's really, I find it funny that I've been intrigued by Natchez for, going on 30 years now. When I moved to Northern Ireland 7 years ago, as a historian, it's always kind of nice to have a local project. For the bulk of my career, my academic career, I was at Michigan State, going to Natchez, Mississippi for research. And so the idea of finding a local topic in Northern Ireland really intrigued me. And I was interested about the history of African descended people in Ireland. And so because I developed a database of the Natchez Free Black community, I really hoped to do that in Ireland, because there have been a small number of scholars who have looked at this issue, the issue of slavery in Ireland. But I came to find out that another scholar, William Hart, had a database that he had been compiling, going from the 1600s to, it goes beyond the period that I'm interested, 1865. But he has not published this database. And so a small group of scholars, Jonathan Wright, who's at the University of Maynooth, and Mark Doyle, who's at Middle Tennessee State University, we contacted Dr. Hart, and we are all working together to try to expand the database, to digitize it. So that's one part, but I cannot get away from Natchez, Dr. Horne. So another, I think, interesting topic is the Irish-born who emigrated to Natchez and who, a number of them actually became enslavers themselves. There were probably about 70 so far that I've identified who became enslavers. But then I'm also interested in some of those stories of people that were either involved in the anti-slavery movement or at least not supportive of the system of slavery, who were Irish born. So I'm looking at that population of people. And again, William Johnson's diary is always such a rich resource to look at, because he has some entries in his diary where he discusses some of the Irish in Natchez, and a lot of it's commenting on, the community and their cultural practices. Natchez was just by its nature a very rowdy place, and William Johnson writes about the Irish at various times getting into physical altercations and that kind of thing. So it's just, to me, that's a fascinating project, is looking at the relations of African Americans and the Irish born. So that's the direction in which it's going.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Ribianszky, Senior Lecturer at Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland, author of the book Generations of Freedom. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with you. Appreciate the opportunity.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Andrew Krinks, author of the book White Property, Black Trespass, Racial Capitalism and the Religious Function of Mass Criminalization. We'd also like to thank Nik Ribianszky, lecturer at Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and author of the book Generations of Freedom, Gender, Movement, and Violence in Natchez, 1779 to 1865. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's or one of our guests' many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Special thanks to Luyanda Kaboka for giving us the African Drumbeat Historic Calendar for the week. Much love to our spiritual backbone, Freedom Now founder and ancestor, Baba Didan Kamathi. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.